One.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Emily Goldner. I'm a Timberlake High School student, and I'm going to be presenting a speech today on the Prohibition Era of the 1920s and the 1930s. So most people are probably familiar with the term bootlegging. Nowadays it's used to describe just general piracy. You all have probably heard of the term bootlegging, right? Yes. So when the term was originally coined, this is not what it actually meant. So this was a term that was originally denoted in the 1890s to describe white settlers who would actually hide flasks of liquor in their bootlegs while they were trading with Native Americans. So like a completely different definition. During the early 19th century, it was specifically used to describe the illegal distribution and production of alcohol during the Prohibition era. Now, I have spent quite a bit of time today researching into the Prohibition era and figuring out the most important parts, like causes and effects about the Prohibition. So I do know what I'm talking about, I promise. So today I'm going to be covering bootlegging specifically during the Prohibition era and what exactly caused the Prohibition era and how the effects of the Prohibition era are still evident today and how we can apply these problems to life today. So bootlegging during the early 20th century mainly pertained, like I said, to the illegal production and distribution of alcohol. The earliest bootleggers before this time actually were smuggling liquor over the Canadian and Mexican border, but by the time of Prohibition, people were just making illegal distilleries. So according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Prohibition ended the sale of liquor and thereby created an illicit supply. As with most things, if you outlaw it, most likely people are going to find any way that they can to still get their hands on it. So you might be wondering, what exactly is the Prohibition era? So the Prohibition was a period during the early 20th century where all of the production and distribution of alcohol was outlawed. This was originally put into practice to try to purge American society of its immoral practices along with the outlaw of prostitution. So according to Francis E. Willard, the leaders of the Prohibition movement were very alarmed at the drinking behavior of Americans, and they were concerned that there was this sort of culture of drinking among the United States population. So the politicians who enacted the 18th Amendment, which caused the Prohibition era, believed that doing so would actually sort of boost national morale and sort of make their country look like it was a good country. This ended up not working at all. So during the Prohibition, there were still ways that they could acquire alcohol, the people I mean. You could go to a doctor with a prescription for medicinal whiskey, and you could also use wine for religious ceremonies. But people actually still ran illegal distilleries. This was a practice that was widespread all over the country. So what they would do, the people who were running these illegal distilleries, is they would use this sort of mash of like potatoes and corn and beets to produce a high-proof alcohol and then mix it with glycerin and juniper oil for added flavoring. So this is definitely a lot easier to acquire, this sort of bathtub gin, as it was coined, because you don't have to acquire it from a registered alcohol distributor like a doctor. You could just make it at home. The main problem with this...
Good afternoon, staff. Please complete anything you're working on, lock your doors, and go home for the weekend. We'll see you Monday.
The main problem with this sort of bathtub gin was the fact that it was very, very dangerous to drink. So the alcohol that they acquired to make this fermentation was usually stolen from factories that produced industrial alcohol. Now, the United States put regulations on this alcohol which required them to add different additives to denature it sort of and make it undrinkable. One of these additives was wood alcohol, also known as methanol alcohol, which is actually used to make fuel and antifreeze. So you're not supposed to drink it. You should not drink it. And in fact, it can actually cause blindness, liver failure, and even death. It's not really good at all. So this was one of the main problems with the Prohibition era, was that this alcohol was being distributed all over the country. There wasn't a lot that was being done to regulate the distribution of this alcohol because of how easy it was to acquire it. So, okay. People didn't want to stop drinking at all. If you regulate something like alcohol, this is actually like one of the most common ways of getting inebriated at the time, because drugs weren't really used that much. People are going to find a way to get around this regulation. The Volstead Act only really led to a rise in urban crime during the Prohibition. It didn't even achieve the goal that it was originally initiated to achieve. So according to Stephen Moss, the national prohibition of alcohol through 1920 and 1933, the noble experiment was undertaken to reduce crime and corruption, solve social problems, reduce the tax burden created by prisons and poorhouses, and improve the health and hygiene of America. The results of that experiment clearly indicated that it was a miserable failure on all counts. The Volstead Act really didn't do anything besides create a very, very dangerous environment for people to be drinking alcohol in the first place, because people weren't going to stop drinking. All it did was make that alcohol that they were drinking dangerous, and also increase urban crime, because the gangs during the time mainly made their money off of bootlegging operations, excuse me. The 18th Amendment did eventually get repealed in 1932 by Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it was actually said that when he was signing the papers to do so, he was actually drinking a dry martini. So that man liked his alcohol. He understood that what the Volstead Act, represented was not something good in the American lives. So by placing pointless regulations on people's lives, the American government only succeeded in making their lives more dangerous, not making them better. If there's one takeaway that I want you guys to, if there's one thing that I want you guys to take away today, is that this is something that can be applied to our lives today. The past experiences of American society can actually be a very useful tool in figuring out ways to deal with our modern problems, such as something that is often on the topic of discussion today is the decriminalization of marijuana. Is it better for people to be smoking unregulated marijuana that is out there and could have anything in it, or is it better for them to be smoking the stuff that is regulated? It's much better to regulate things than it is to completely outlaw them.